All right, you're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Philip Almond. Philip is an emeritus professor of the University of Queensland and an author of many books, including his most recent work, which we will be speaking about today, Noah and the Flood in Western Thought. Philip, thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Good to be here.
So I think just to get started and set the scene a little bit, you talked about very early on that Noah's flood is not a super original story. If anything, it's a very, very common tale, a common structure that there was a massive flood that destroyed a lot of people except for one guy and his family. This has popped up all over the world. But Noah's flood has had sort of some unique staying power. And I'm curious, why is that? And why is Noah's flood so important in Western thought, literature, etc.?
Well, I think the flood of Noah's become very important within Western culture because it's embedded in, one of the main texts within Western culture, the Bible. So it flows on from there. It's also important, I think, because, the biblical story itself is really another creation story. So within the biblical account, we have the story of Adam and Eve. And then God realizes subsequently that he's made a bit of a muck up of the whole business because there's human wickedness everywhere. And God regrets having created the world and thinks, look, I think I'll have another go. So he decides to wipe out the world except for Noah and his family and the animals that Noah takes onto the ark, which God instructs Noah to build. So the important thing about the story, not only in Christianity, but subsequently too in Rabbinic Judaism and in Islam, is that we really have in the story of Noah a new creation story. And most importantly of all, I think, we have in the story of Noah the creation of new humanity. Because in a sense, Noah is the descendant of Adam and Eve, and everyone else is gone. And so Noah becomes the start of a new humanity. And his three sons become the progenitors of the subsequent human race that develops after the flood. So I think that's the importance of the story within Christianity and Judaism and Islam. It's a new start. It's a new creation story.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think going off of that, I'm curious, there's all these other narratives that maybe have different characters but the same structure. Judaism, Islam, Christianity all do share the actual character. But is there a different way in which each of these religions remember the figure of Noah and how they talk about him?
Well, I think the important thing about the biblical story is that in contrast to a lot of the other Near Eastern flood narratives, it's not arbitrary as a consequence of the arbitrary gods playing around with humanity. It's really the consequence of a very moral deity who's upset with human wickedness. So it's the only ancient creation story that says that God decided to end it all due to human wickedness. Interesting, therefore, that the earth comes to an end as a result of God deciding there's far too much human wickedness, and a cataclysmic climate event occurs, which ends the whole thing. So no contemporary relevance there then, no relevance at all to us. So I think that's the key issue there, that it is, in a sense, a reconstruction, a recreation of the world, which is down to human wickedness when God decides to start it all over again. Yeah.
And is there even a distinction from, the Jewish, Christian, Islamic view of Noah from each other? I guess the Jewish and Christian, actual literal telling is basically identical. But I'm not sure if there's even some nuance in just the way that it's remembered and talked about among the followers of those religions. And I'm not sure what's different about the Islamic Noah.
Yes, there's two Noahs that occur in the biblical story. And one Noah is the righteous person, the man of righteousness whom God decides to save along with his family. And then there's another Noah tucked away in the story, the Noah that after the flood uh, plants a vineyard, makes wine, gets drunk off his face, and then is seen by one of his sons and covered over by two of the others. So all of those religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, really try to find out how they're going to balance out this very righteous Noah with the guy who, after the flood, made a bit of a muck of the whole thing. Islam, I think, probably underplays as much as possible the Noah who gets drunk. Judaism probably does much the same thing. Christianity manages it, but all of them have to manage this double figure of Noah within the biblical material itself, of the only man who was worth saving, as against the guy who the first thing he does when he gets off the ark is get drunk and wipe himself out completely into a state of unconsciousness. So all three traditions try to find the way through that story. Probably Islam sees Noah as the most righteous man because he's one of the key prophets for Islam. For Christianity, he's not quite as important. He's not as important as Adam, for example, within the Christian tradition. Judaism, somewhere in between. But each of them, as I say, is trying to balance out these two different Noahs from the original text.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think another piece of something that surprised me as I was thinking about it, um, was that you shared, outside of the Abrahamic traditions, many of the other flood narratives, um, the guy who's saved, he has a moment where he goes through a lot of grief and mourning, for the fact that, obviously that, the population is being wiped out, and that, it's a very human thing. And of course, you would expect that. But as far as I can tell, I believe that's lacking from, the Hebrew telling of the flood narrative. And why might that be? Am I missing something? Does Noah mourn? Does he grieve? And if not, why might that be missing?
Now, there's nothing in the original story that says that Noah thinks, well, this is a terrible business that's about to happen. Humanity's about to be wiped out. All the animals are about to be wiped out. But in the retelling, the many retellings and reshapings of the story that occur in those religious traditions, there's often a sense of a Noah who grieves for the fate of humanity, a Noah who actually, which isn't in the biblical text, a Noah who goes out and preaches to people to try to get them to repent, a guy who does regret the fact that all these apparently, well, not apparently, actually quite innocent animals are all going to be wiped out as a consequence of human wickedness. So the traditions develop a much richer psychological Noah, as it were, one who does regret what's about to come, who does try to persuade his contemporaries to repent before the end is coming, while they generally ignore him, mock him, on occasions burn down the ark that he's trying to build, so he has to rebuild one, beat him up on occasions, send along thugs to give him a good thrashing, and so on. So in that sense, the traditions try to build up a much more human Noah than we find in the original story.
Hmm. And is that distinct to the story of Noah, or is that something that religions are always doing to their character to sort of, I don't know, modernize them to have the same sorts of, emotions that we have? Is that super common, or is this a Noah isolated thing?
Well, I think it's a standard move within myth making generally. And what we find with the biblical text is there are so many incoherencies, so many inconsistencies, so many gaps within the story that it's a kind of myth maker's paradise. So the bare bones in the Bible do create an opportunity for later myth makers to really go, well, to take the story where they want to take it, and therefore to create a much richer person of Noah, and of course also a much richer character with his sons and his wife and his daughters-in-law. So, they become characters, they get named. Some of their sons in particular, Ham, play a much more significant role while the ark's rolling around in the flood and so on. So the embellishments of the story within the traditions allow for this really rich cast of characters. So you move from a kind of biblical storyboard to the opportunity of a full-length feature movie within the later characterizations of Noah until finally, in 2015, along comes a nice full-length feature movie with Russell Crowe doing his Noah and so on. But the biblical story, just provides a kind of storyboard, and it's that very minimal story in the Bible that enables later interpreters within the tradition and outside of the tradition to create these enormous complex narratives of the story of the flood.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one you do a fair amount of citing and referencing is the Book of Enoch, and I thought that was really interesting. I'm not super familiar with the book, but can you talk about why that's important to understanding the Noah story? Kind of what role the Book of Enoch plays in what gaps it fills in, and what you find interesting about it.
Look, the Enoch story is the story essentially of the story of the Watchers. So it's one of the odd little stories within the book of Genesis that pops up between the time of the creation and the story of Noah. And that's the story that in some ways can be developed into a story of the origin of demons and fallen angels. But it's essentially the story of the sons of God who look down upon the earth and see the daughters of men and decide that they might like to mate with the daughters of men. And so there's the sons of God come down to earth and mate with the daughters of men. And then the text says simply, and there were giants on the earth in those days. And then we move straight into, and God saw that the wickedness of men was so great that he decided he had to stop the whole thing. So the story of the Watchers is a kind of interesting little story within the text of Genesis about what later becomes to be read as the fall of the angels, really, and the creation of the devil in some texts. And so it's a little story which emphasizes how enormously wicked humanity had become, and that's the point of that little Enoch story that gets read out of that. Just a few verses about the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men and they were fair
Hmm.
and decided to mate with them.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up, some of these more mysterious spiritual beings, and I want to talk to you a little bit about angels and demons because I know you've written about that pretty significantly in the past. Probably most pointedly, you wrote a biography of the devil.
Mm.
So I think you're a good person to talk to about angels and demons. Um, how are they a part of the flood narrative? Why, how are they included? Why might they be included? What do they add to the story?
Well, I'm not sure that the story of the Watchers and add anything particularly to the flood narrative going down the line. The importance of the story of the Watchers and the sons of God looking upon the daughters of men is that for a while it becomes the dominative narrative within the Christian tradition for the first, say, couple of 100 years of how angels fell down and became demons. So it's the story of the origin of evil in the world, really, through the fall of the angels who become fallen angels. Subsequently, that's replaced by another story within Christianity about the fall of the angels. And according to that story, the fall of the angels occurs pretty soon after God creates the angels, which is before even the creation of Adam and Eve. And that enables the Christian tradition, when it takes the fall of the angels back to a time before the creation of Adam and Eve, to reconstruct the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve, who brings about the fall of Adam and Eve by tempting Eve with the apple or whatever the fruit was. That brings about the capacity for Christianity to identify the serpent in the Garden of Eden with the devil. So that becomes the dominant narrative within the Christian tradition about the origin of the devil, that the devil fell shortly after he was created, along with other angels, and before the creation of Adam and Eve. And then the serpent can become the devil. And the story of the origin of the devil from the angels who fell because they lusted after the daughters of men, that tends to drop out of the Christian tradition. as a story about the origin of evil beings.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I'm not
I
sure it makes sense, but
no,
anyway,
I
I know
no,
what you mean.
it's yeah, right. It's one of those things, right? I mean, angels and demons are I mean, the problem is we're so clouded. It's very cloudy because there is a billion interpretations of what that
Yeah,
is, and really there's kind of one interpretation where we have these little happy guys with the harps, little evil guys with the horns,
yeah,
and those are often getting in the way of the very complicated beings that biblical texts and other ancient texts talked about. Um, and honestly, I think that's really related to the story of Noah in general. I had a professor my freshman year of college in a Hebrew literature class, Dr. Drew Johnson, who would always talk about how it's so ironic that the flood of Noah is, Noah's Ark is often painted on the walls of nurseries and is like in all these children's books when it's really like this incredibly violent story where there would have been corpses floating everywhere and mass destruction, and it's just dark.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
add it to the list of things that pop culture has dumbed down for us. I don't
Well,
know.
it's very interesting because one of the issues that the early commentators did try to deal with was, well, what kind of a God is this who will
Mm,
create all this stuff and then decide, oh, well, okay, I didn't do too well there. I'm going to start it all again. So it raised issues about the wisdom and goodness of God in his creation of the world.
mm,
He was either not very good in what he did at creating the world that he did, or he wasn't particularly wise in the way that he first set it up. So that, there are always deeper theological questions for all of the traditions to be dealt with around why God took such drastic action as he
mm,
did in wiping out everybody and virtually starting again.
mm. And is that part of the reason there's so many interpretations? Is that one of the holes that people are trying to fill in, is their
Yeah,
own
I think that
explanations?
exactly. That really is one of the theological gaps that you want to fill in, because you do want to justify the ways of God to man in that particular case,
Yeah.
because it's a restart
Mm,
of creation. Now, there's a sense in which the Christian tradition, I think, underplays the importance of Noah, because it always wants to emphasize the importance of Adam. And so, particularly from the time of St. Augustine, the Christian tradition focuses on the fall of Adam, and then Christ as the second Adam who redeems the world. And Noah, in that sense, in the big theological picture of things, can drop out of the system a little bit. He doesn't so much in Judaism and Islam, but that's mainly because in Judaism and Islam, the doctrine of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden doesn't play such a central role as it has done in the Christian tradition. Judaism and Islam don't have that sense of humanity as corrupt by nature as Christianity does after Augustine. What
mm,
Islam and Judaism has, therefore, is a kind of bigger emphasis on the importance of the flood story as the
mm,
restarting of things, rather than the fall of man as the key moment in early human history.
mm. Yeah, and I'm curious, going back to what you're talking about with the justification of why God um, destroys everything. How does the Abrahamic religious view of why God does that differ from some of these other flood narratives? What are the other common, you know, justifications that these other gods use to destroy the world through a flood?
Look, I think the Judaism and the Christian and the Muslim stories are predominantly about human wickedness. The other classical narratives, or the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Roman and Greek flood stories, that essentially come out of the Babylonian story of of the flood. they're essentially about the frivolity of the gods. They don't focus on human wickedness. It's the gods can't sleep at night because all these humans are making a lot of noise, so they decide to send a flood to wipe out human beings because they can't sleep, and that kind of thing. You know, they're playful flood stories in a way that the biblical story is the sort of the ancient flood story, which has the moral overtones of a God who can no longer put up with the wickedness of human beings.
Hmm.
So I think that's probably the uniqueness of the biblical tale, that is about a moral deity who can no longer put up with human wickedness, whereas the classical stories from the Babylonian tradition and the Greek and Roman stories of the flood much more focused on, gods being rather frivolous about the whole thing.
Huh. Okay, so if anything, there are, you know, I don't know, fewer holes in terms in this story, and yet still we're trying to fill in the we're trying to fill in God's reasoning. That's interesting to me. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Um, I I also wanted to talk to you about like, I mean, you do go through a lot of how does all of this, you go through a lot of how does this relate to science,
Mm.
because you know early on you make very clear this flood narrative is ubiquitous. It happens on every continent except Antarctica. And so I think many readers probably would have the conclusion like, okay, then maybe there really was some kind of massive flood. If everybody everywhere had this same idea, how much does science allow for that? What I mean, how much does science back up the idea that there could have been a great worldwide flood?
Yeah, I think what happens is that, from the beginning of the Christian era, let's say up to the period around the year 1500, then the debate about the flood and Noah takes place within the Christian tradition.
Hmm.
But from about 1500 onwards, you get a couple of things going on. The first one is it's the age of exploration. So suddenly, where you thought you only had a limited number of animals, as exploration takes place, suddenly there are thousands of animals, and you have to start to worry about how you're going to fit all these animals on the ark. So that's one big problem that arises. Later down the line, there's another problem that arises as a consequence of the rise of science, and that's the question of how universal was the flood. The biblical material suggests it was a universal flood for obvious reasons. So then they figured, well, if the Bible's correct and it's a universal flood, then how did all these animals that we're now discovering on these other continents get there? Where did they come from? How did they get there? And if all the animals came from the two by two by two that were on the ark, and if the ark had landed somewhere in the mountains of Ararat, as the biblical text says, or let's say for sake of argument in Turkey for the moment, how did the animals get across to America after the flood? And how did they do it so quickly when the flood only happened, a couple of thousand years ago? Because all of this debate, both within the Christian framework and within the framework of science as it begins to worry about the ark, is taking place in a context in which it was believed, inside and outside of the Christian tradition, that the earth was only created about 4004 BCE. And therefore, that all of this happened around about, according to biblical chronology, about 2500 BC. So, somehow or another, from the time of the flood in 2500 BC to where we are now when we're discovering the Americas, from the few animals that were on this relatively small ark, this vast number of animals were created and they spread to the four corners of the world. How did that happen? So these are the kind of puzzles about Noah and the ark that are coming up as a consequence of the exploration of the world, of the discovery of all the new animals, of questions of not only how the animals got to where they were, but if creation or if humanity began again from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, when we go to America and we come across Native Americans, where did they come from? which son of Noah are they the heirs of? Are they Hamites, Shemites, Japhethites? So there are a whole web of questions that continually come up from about 1500 onwards, partly exploration, partly the rise of science. And then there's the fossil record. What are we going to do with fossils? How do we measure the fossils that we're coming across in the light of the story of the flood narrative and so on?
Hmm.
It's a
Yeah.
mess.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, is there any way that, is the furthering of science only, only a problem for the young earth creationist Christian biblical literalist, or has there been any, developments in science that are actually helpful to maybe proof of a biblical flood? Or is that all been helpful to it, or has it all been, you know,
It's all been
just
bad news. Simple.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think the overall drift of the scientific evidence has been towards two things.
Hmm.
It's been towards biblical chronology no longer being on the table. That is to say that the earth is millions of years old and not the 6,000 that the Bible indicates. That's the first thing. And along with that goes the notion that, the fossils that people were finding on the tops of mountains, which they thought were evidence of the flood, were actually not evidence of a universal flood at all, but were evidence of big geological things happening millions of years ago. So everything was conspiring against the biblical account of the age of the world, and hence the time when the flood took place. And everything scientifically was conspiring against the notion that there had been a universal flood that wiped out everything and that it all had to start again.
Yeah.
So the science, the science of geology, to some extent anthropology, all of those new sciences developing in the 17th and 18th centuries made it progressively more difficult to hold to the literal truth of the biblical account, even in the most general sense of there having been in the not too distant past a universal flood.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think just going back to where I started with this question is, what are, why do you think then, assuming that we're right, science is right and there wasn't one, why is it everywhere? Why was this a ubiquitous story? Why is the idea of a universal flood so compelling to, humans all over the world?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. I mean, people are probably aware of the devastation that local floods do, and therefore, if they're thinking about how the world will end, they universalize local floods. So, we can say simply, that if we take the Epic of Gilgamesh, from which there comes the biblical story, then the Epic of Gilgamesh comes out of Babylonia, and that's where there's the confluence of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that's a geographical space in which floods regularly occur. So the first story in literate form of a universal flood comes out of a flood-prone geographical space. So that's a kind of simple way of saying, flood stories pop up all over the place because people are used to there being floods, and so they universalize when they start to think, well, how all this is going to end. Something like that.
Yeah, yeah, no. No, I know. I'm not expecting you to have the perfect answer to it, but I appreciate you trying. Um, we're about out of time, and we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk about how you end the book, which is with an epilogue that mentions how, our current reality of climate crisis can sort of mirror um the climate crisis of Noah's day. How can the story of Noah and the story of these universal floods and how people reacted to them, how can they um, aid us in our work towards fighting against environmental disasters in
Yeah,
our current present day state?
yeah. I spun the epilogue off Aronofsky's film Noah, with Russell Crowe doing this sort of doing his Noah thing. But I thought the interesting thing about the film was, and something that the contemporary environmental debate asks, although not very often, within the film, Noah worries himself to death about whether it would be a better thing if humanity was wiped out as well,
Mm,
as you know, and not just him and his family, whether he should end humanity also.
mm,
And that raised the question for me, whether we have to ask the question, will the future of the planet be better if there are no longer human beings on it?
mm,
Well, in the film, Noah decides that, well, on balance, I think I'll hang around because I think we can do something to save the world rather than, we can do good to save the world rather than the world repair itself in our absence. So that for me was a kind of very, very powerful story about what we're facing in the current environmental crisis.
mm,
If you don't happen to believe in the doctrine of providence, if you don't happen to believe that at the end of the day, this is all in God's hands and it's all working out a perfect plan that He had from the beginning, if you don't happen to believe that, then the future of the planet isn't in God's hands anymore, it's in our hands. And I think the story of Noah indicates to us that, the world did then, the myth is the myth of the world coming to an end as a consequence of human wickedness. And we're facing now a story of the world that may come to an end as a consequence of human wickedness, of our looking after ourselves rather than looking after the well-being of the planet. So I think that's the power of Noah and the story of the flood within our culture, because we, like Noah and his family, are facing the end of the world as a consequence of the complete obliviousness of most of humanity to what could happen to the planet. That's the power of the Noah story.
mm. Yeah, well said. Um, Everybody, that is Philip C. Almond. His book is Noah and the Flood in Western Thought. You can check that out at the link in the description. No, sorry, I called you Noah. Philip, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate having you on.
Thanks very much, Matthew. It's been very good. Thanks.